Okay, so I want this to be a two-part video, and today we're going to talk about some teams that embarrass themselves. Week 1 is about halfway over right now, as at the time of recording this, it is currently 5:30, and the afternoon games are starting to go into the second half. There have been some teams who have made an absolute fool of themselves so far this year. These teams either had high expectations and blew it, or were just absolutely awful in Week 1. Today we're going to talk about these 5 examples, but before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's go ahead and get started and talk about some teams that embarrassed themselves in Week 1 so far. Okay, so at number 5 for me, I have the Wake Forest Deacons. Sure, Wake Forest has an argument at being the worst Power 4 team in football history, but over the last few years, they've been pretty solid. Dave Clawson was a program builder coach, and he did a lot with very little at Wake Forest. Unfortunately, he would end up retiring, and they moved forward with Jake Dickert. He was the head coach at Washington State, and he ended up doing solid with the Cougars before taking the job at Wake Forest. There was some controversy with that move, but no matter what, he was the head coach for the Deacons and had a lot of work cut out for him. The first job for him was finding a new starting quarterback, as Hank Bachmeier had gone off to the NFL. I think he got cut. The guys he brought in included Robbie Ashford and Deshaun Purdy. Both of these players could not be more different, as Robbie Ashford was a blue-chip recruit and is now on his 4th school, whereas Deshaun Purdy was a 3-star recruit who spent 1 year at Charlotte before transferring for his 2nd season to Wake Forest after a brief stop at Florida. There was a weird saga with that. Expectations were not high for Wake Forest, as many believed they'd be at the bottom of the ACC, but what happened in Week 1 was absolutely embarrassing for them. They'd end up facing off with the worst team in the FBS in Kennesaw State, who's now on their 2nd coach in school history and their 2nd year in the FBS. I mean, Kennesaw State is absolutely horrible. This game was also at home, and the fans just straight up did not care. There was pretty much no one in attendance for this game, but honestly, they missed out on a somewhat thrilling game. Forest Deacons would end up winning 10-9 after Kennesaw State could not execute at the end. What's really embarrassing is that Kennesaw State actually missed an extra point. That's the reason why they only lost by 1, but Wake Forest also had a blocked field goal in the first half. They didn't really get anything going. They had a key injury, and this was just embarrassing. Jake Dickert is now 1-0 as a head coach at Wake Forest, but they beat the worst team in the country by 1 point. If Wake Forest wants any amount of respect, that did not gain them any. And if anything, I don't know if they're much better than Stanford or Northwestern right now. The second team I'm going to talk about is the UCF Knights. They ended up playing on the Thursday night slot as they would face off with Jacksonville State, and ultimately they won 17-10. It was a very interesting Week 1 matchup as they brought Scott Frost back. He was the coach that brought them the national relevance, especially back in 2017. But after flaming out at Nebraska and taking some time off, he is now back coaching the Knights. A lot has changed for UCF since then, as they went from the American all the way over to the Big 12, and so far it has not been a great adjustment, but Frost is hopefully the guy to fix things. It looks like the 2025 team is going to struggle a bit, as they lost RJ Harvey, and they'd also have to find a new quarterback. Ultimately, Frost would go at Cam Fancher, the transfer from Florida Atlantic, as his Week 1 starter, but he would get injured early on, and they were sort of in a messy spot from there. The game was also delayed. Jacksonville State was up 10-3. But Taven Jackson, the transfer from Indiana, came in and saved the day for the Knights as he had 2 touchdowns in the 4th quarter, including a 33-yard late touchdown to DJ Black. UCF would win 17-10, and while Jackson State is pretty solid for the size of school they are, this was kind of embarrassing for UCF. When honestly, they probably should have had it over at halftime, and I think UCF, like Wake Forest, will probably be near the bottom of the Big 12 and did not get themselves a lot of respect. They also need to go all in on Taven Jackson, and I have no idea why he wasn't the starter from the get-go. The third school that absolutely embarrassed themselves in Week 1 was the Northwestern Wildcats. They have not been very good since the 2020 season, as the whole Pat Fitzgerald saga was super interesting, and they moved forward with David Braun. He had a good 2023 season, but since then, it has been tough sledding for the Wildcats. They've struggled to field a decent quarterback, and they might have put out the worst quarterback in the country this weekend. After having a great career at SMU, he ended up getting hurt and was benched, and Preston Stone ended up in Evanston. In his first game as a starter in the purple uniform, he threw 4 interceptions, and Northwestern got killed 23-3 by Tulane. The Green Wave are a really good program. Losing at home this badly to a group of 5 school is absolutely embarrassing for Northwestern. They have just been a terrible football team the last few years, and I don't see much hope for them, to be honest. Their schedule is pretty difficult, and their best chance to win a game comes next week against Western Illinois. Honestly, they probably are going to win that, and if they don't, they should just end the program, but I don't see Northwestern winning more than 2 games this year. It's hard for me to pick them to beat any sort of Big Ten team, and they just don't seem to have it anymore. I don't know if Northwestern honestly cares that much about building a successful football program, and while it's been a lot of lows for them the last few years, this might be a new one. They weren't even competitive in this game, and it looks like Northwestern fans are in for another long, boring, and sad football season. I hope things improve for them soon, but they definitely embarrassed themselves in the noon window. For our 4th school, I don't know if there was a more embarrassing performance in terms of expectation than the Boise State game on Thursday. The Broncos would face off with the USF Bulls out of Tampa, Florida for their first matchup, and this game did not go according to plan. Boise State losing wasn't all that shocking to me, as I thought Boise was pretty overrated to be honest, but the expectations from last year were that Boise was the top team for the Group of 5 spot for this year's playoff, and they wanted to disprove the narrative that they weren't just Ashton Jeanty last year. It looks like the critics were kind of right, as Jeanty carried Boise State last year. This year's team really struggled to get going, as they got blown out 34-7 by USF, and it got ugly in the second half. The epitome of this game was when USF put in their backup quarterback as the punter, and he threw a fake punt touchdown. That was one of the most electric moments of the first night of college football, but Boise State was just shell-shocked. They were dropping passes, committing penalties, and they looked nothing like last year's team. It looks like Ashton Jeanty will be desperately missed by them, and I don't think Maddox Madsen was honestly that good of a quarterback. Boise lost 34-7, and this was embarrassing for them, and I like USF, but it's not like I think the Bulls are the best team in college football either. USF definitely deserves plenty of credit, and they're definitely a contender, but this said a lot more about Boise State in my opinion. Maybe it's just a one-time fluke though, and they still have a path to 10 wins, but there's honestly no chance they go into Notre Dame and beat the number 6 Irish. Spencer Danielson and the Broncos have a lot to figure out before next week's game against Eastern Washington, and we'll see if they can bounce back, but it was embarrassing getting killed 34-7. And our final team I want to talk about today is the Army Black Knights. They were the only school to lose to an FCS program, as the Tarleton State Texans came up to West Point and got their second win of the 2025 college football season. Honestly, this was a very interesting game, as no one expected Tarleton State to really win. Army kind of had control most of the game, but Tarleton made a late comeback, and Army also lost their starting quarterback. While their backup was a decent scrambler, the game ended up being chaos at the end. It was tied going into the last few seconds, and Army sent out a kicker who had never been in that situation. It looked like they had a chance to have a walk-off winner, but instead he hooked it. The crowd went absolutely silent, and it was sort of embarrassing for him. As they got to overtime, Tarleton barely did anything with the ball, but they would end up having a field goal. Army was not able to score a touchdown, and then they lined it up from the middle and hit a decent field goal. The game was tied going into second overtime, and I guess Army thought that their kicker's confidence was back. He lined up for another one and hooked it to the left. It wasn't even close, and now Tarleton State just needed to run a couple of plays and then kick a game-winning field goal and go home. That's exactly what they did, and they pulled off one of their biggest wins ever. Army was a ranked team who had a Heisman contender last year in Bryson Daly, and now they are 0-1, lost to an FCS school, and lost in the most embarrassing way. That kicker is definitely going to need some emotional support this week, but Tarleton State pulled off the upset of the season so far with a 30-27 win against Army, and Army's season is already over. So yeah, today I talked about 5 teams who embarrassed themselves in week 1 of college football so far, and I plan to do a part 2. I mean, it already looks like Alabama is heading that way, but for now we'll just have to wait and see. If you're a fan of one of these schools, what do you think the season's going to look like for you? Which topic should I do in my next video? And before you go, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and check out some of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.